We're going? All right, we're going? Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming. It means so much that you are all showing up for me physically in person or online on the live stream. Just to start out, some ground rules, since not all of you are familiar with this space, and also not really necessarily familiar with the topic. If you're not sure what I am talking about, I'm doing my best. There's some Jews here, there's some non-Jews here, there's some queer folks here, there's some non-queer folks here, there's some academics here, there's some non-academics here. So raise your hand. I will be happy to make sure that you are following along with what I'm saying. Also, if you're online, obviously you can't raise your hand, so Google is free. Do your best. Bathrooms are down the hall to the right. If you need to go, go. And finally, we're going to have food, a little bit of nosh in the social hall at the end. That's going to be for part of the Q&A session, but I'm going to start the Q&A session before we go so that the online people have a chance to actually reach me before we dip. So with that being said, let's just get started. So I want to give a quick shout out to my research mentor, Dr. Tenley Vick. She could not make it today because she has family things, but she's been very helpful to me and has really made it possible for me to do this research. So thank you to her. She's amazing. So first is kind of the literature review. That's what we call it in the biz. And that is basically looking at everything that there is possibly to know about the topic. And one might think that there's not a lot when it comes to transgender Jews, but actually there is a lot. You just have to know where to look. So I'm not going to go over everything. If you were walking in the physical person, we had a handout right up there that kind of goes over some, like this is not an exhaustive literature review, but it goes over some examples. So I'm not going to go too heavy. If you're online, I don't know if this is going to work, but hopefully this is big enough that you can go ahead and scan that to try and access the Google Doc. If that doesn't work, I'm sorry. So there is a lot of literature on queer Jews. There's less on trans Jews. But in terms of what we talk about when we talk about trans Jewish identity, it's not really stable across the board. Our definitions shift like every 10 years. So there's really not a good idea. And I just really love this quote. It's by a trans Jew, Noach Shmora. While the common aphorism states that for every 2 Jews, there are 3 opinions, one might say of the transgender Jewish community, 2 transgender Jews, 10 opinions. And that's if you ask on a Tuesday. All this to say that trans Jews, transness and Jewishness are both really expansive categories. And what I'm going to give you today is not going to represent all of it. There's no way for that to happen. Also, just a quick note. When we say the word trans, that definition is very new. Even 10 years ago, transgender included drag performers, it included gender nonconforming gay people, and what we think of transgender today was referred to as transsexual, someone who physically transitions. And so if 10 years ago the definition of trans changed, the way that we are going to look at like trans history, it's not going to be one-to-one, and I'm just going to go with things that are gender interesting. So there's a lot of gender weirdness in Jewish texts. In the Torah or the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, there's a lot of examples. It's in your source sheet, but to just give some examples, Adam and Eve, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Dinah, and so on and so forth. There's a lot. The Talmud also has a lot of interesting gender stories, like a rabbi who was so beautiful that he was confused for a woman a lot, or a rabbi who, in order to learn compassion, underwent essentially pseudo pregnancy pains. There's a lot of gender weirdness. One thing that I do want to bring up is in the Talmud, they are very interested in defining what people's roles are in society. And that is sometimes based on what you've got going on anatomically. So the Talmud recognized that people aren't anatomically in two categories. And this is not just intersexness. This is a lot of things. I kind of explain it in your source sheet, but essentially you can separate people in two categories of Zachar, which is a reproducing male, Nekeva, reproducing female, Ilonit, a non-reproducing female, as in someone who they came out and we went, it's a girl, and then they did not develop the way that was expected, or were castrated in some way. Or the masculine equivalent of that, Saris, could be someone who was physically castrated and is therefore not able to reproduce as a male, or could be someone who just didn't develop as expected. There's also androgynos, which is someone, that's a Greek word, someone who has two functioning reproductive systems. I don't know that this is actually possible, but the Talmud doesn't really care if it's possible. They just want to learn how to categorize people. And then finally, the tumtum, which is someone who has kind of indeterminate sex, maybe something in between, or just not really sure. So this is not to say that the Talmud was recognizing 6 different genders. It was more like recognizing that bodies came in a lot of different ways, and it was interested in defining where someone fell in terms of their obligations to society. If you can't reproduce, you are not obligated to reproduce. Makes sense. In other texts, there's some interesting things. Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, recognizes that there is something called a soul gender that is maybe different from your body's gender, and considers it that your official real gender that you should follow, the rules for, is your soul gender, not your body gender. Also says it's not hard for God to change someone's gender if God feels like it. So that's pretty interesting. With regards to the Talmud, they also discuss what the gender roles are for the society. And when I talk about the Talmud, we kind of have to be a little bit clearer. There are actually 2 Talmuds. There's the Babylonian Talmud and there's the Jerusalem Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud was used by Sephardic Jews, North Africa, Spain, Portugal area, but it was never finished because it was kind of a rough place to be if you were a Jew. So never got finished. The Babylonian Talmud was more used by Ashkenazi Jews in Central and Eastern Europe, and it was finished because, at least at the time, it was a little better to be a Jew. So the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud are mostly the same, but there are some differences. And one of the differences is in the Babylonian Talmud, they discuss certain things with gender roles that I think is really, really interesting. The scholar Daniel Boyarin calls it cross-gendered gender roles, essentially that a man's job is to, if they can afford a single income household, the man goes to a study house and studies Torah 7 to 8 hours a day. Does not work a job, doesn't really do much around the house, just studies Torah and teaches the kids Torah. And then the wife does everything else. She has a job, she speaks different languages to be able to do business with non-Jews. She runs the house, she cooks, she cleans, she raises the kids. Totally not fair, not fair at all. But it does end up having these sort of gendered personalities that were more normal. So the ideal Jewish man was someone who was quieter, more intellectual, passive, and meek. And the ideal Jewish woman was very outspoken and dominant. And the Romans, who were interacting with the Jews who were writing the Babylonian Talmud, they did not like that. They did not enjoy it. They thought that it was weird and gay. And so the Babylonian Talmud actually responds to the Roman response to it, which is that the Babylonian Talmud rabbis say that if there is a man who lives like a Roman, wears Roman clothes, carries a weapon when he just goes out, he probably beats his wife, and that's why we're better than them, which is bonkers and definitely not true, but still very funny. And I bring this up because the Roman response is really similar to the Victorian response later down the line in Ashkenazi Jewish culture. The Victorians also thought weird and gay, I don't know what the Jews are doing, but there's something queer about it. And so they didn't really see Jews as possible to be like straight, normal sexuality, normal gender, normal. And so that's really interesting. And for me personally, I really see those in like the modern evolutions of like gendered stereotypes, particularly in American Ashkenazi Jewish communities. So we have like the nice Jewish boy, the NJB, who is compared to his non-Jewish counterparts, a lot more sensitive, nerdy, maybe less athletic, and at least in a lot of like 90s rom-com type things, less attractive, even though Paul Rudd is attractive. What do you mean? There's also the sort of Jewish mother stereotype of a woman who is really dominating and controlling and holds her sons back from their true potential. And the Jewish American princess, a girl who somehow has her male relatives wrapped around her little finger where they give her a lot of money and expensive gifts. Now, Karen Brodkin, a sociologist, has a really interesting critique of the last two. Obviously, those two are just like steeped in misogyny. But she argues that the Jewish mother and the Jewish American princess stereotypes are actually Jewish men's anxiety about assimilation mapped onto a female body. That the Jewish mother is this fear of, if we don't assimilate, will we be held back from what we could possibly do in this new country? And then also the fear that if we do assimilate and we assimilate too much and we lose our true core values, is American culture that we're assimilating to just empty consumerism? And that is a very interesting argument. Please check her out. She wrote a really cool book about race in America, and yeah, it's very good. Karen Brodkin. I fall into a camp that is kind of known as futurism, loosely defined as I want to be able to imagine and create a future that is improved from today. And in order to do that, we need to be able to picture it. And so I'm not trying to allow anyone any kind of like option to shirk responsibility or avoid accountability. I think we're all in this together to make a future that is better and more inclusive. And I also think that looking at this past that we have is really useful for establishing precedents for Jewish law, because halacha, Jewish law, is something that a lot of Orthodox Jews and some conservative Jews really live by. And it's something that's important to all Jewish people in some way or another. And unfortunately, halacha doesn't hold a lot of space for queerness. And so if we can show the ways that there are precedents for this, hopefully we can establish that there is a halachic precedent to include queer Jews. I can't really represent Orthodox trans Jews, unfortunately, but I know that they're struggling, and I want this to also help them in some ways. Overall, though, this presentation is mainly for you guys, and you guys are not trans Jews. And so what I really want you guys to take from this is what to do going forward to make wherever you are better and more inclusive and more safe for trans Jews. There's a lot of historical records of trans Jews in all of history. I'm not going to go over all of them. There's some in your source sheets, but it goes from a poet in 1332 up to an accepted trans man in a Ukrainian shtetl in the 1800s, up to the very first trans person to undergo a sexual reassignment surgery, all Jews. And I think that's amazing. There's also a lot of queer representation in literature. A lot of Yiddish literature has a lot of queer representation and gender things. Even more modern Jewish sitcoms like The Nanny and Curb Your Enthusiasm and Broad City really wrestle with these ideas. There's a lot. And there's also a lot of important Jewish figures in the queer community. Magnus Hirschfeld was the very first person to establish an LGBT center in Europe in the 1930s in Germany. And he was Jewish, he was gay, he was a very big advocate for trans people. He coined the terms transsexual and transvestite. And it's actually kind of because of him that the Nazis went after queer people and queer studies and research. He was it. There's also examples like queer theorists Leslie Feinberg and Judith Butler, who are cited in every university ever. Harvey Milk was an early activist for the gay community. The modern trans activist Jazz Jennings is Jewish. There's even like Rabbi Elliot Kukla, the first trans person to be ordained as a rabbi. This was in 2006, I believe. And he has been really, really helpful in creating a lot of blessings for transition. For Jewish people, saying a blessing when you do something significant is a really big thing. And so he has written a lot of stuff of what do you say when you do your first tee shot or something like that. There's also a lot of organizations for queer Jews, and I want to highlight those for any queer Jews watching. Jewish Queer Youth and Keshet, Eshel, and then there's also like queer yeshivas like Shalmala and Sfara. The last two, Sfara and Shalmala, they actually put together a really cool event about trans Judaism. I was able to attend on Zoom, and they actually got a bunch of trans Jews together to write Jewish arguments using Jewish texts for different trans topics like going into the mikveh, having a circumcision, etc. It was really, really interesting, and I hope that that continues because I think it's going to be so significant. So why the exhaustive lit review? Why does it matter that I'm giving you this handout? Well, first of all, knowing the context that we're going into when we're interviewing trans Jews is important because there's no way to understand it otherwise. But also, knowing the content is actually so important to affirming that trans Jews belong. If you can show that we have been here forever, then it's a lot harder to get rid of us. And so that's something that I hope you guys can take away, is like literally physically take home this packet and look at it. Now you may be wondering, are there many trans Jews? That's a minority of a minority. There can't be that many. But interestingly, I actually got into this research because I was like, why do I know so many gay Jews? Why don't I know more straight Jews? That's really weird. And looking at it, there is a pretty high number of queer Jews. Proportionally, it seems like a little bit disproportionate. There's also a noted trend over the past 10 years of a lot of transgender people converting to Judaism. There was an anecdote from 10 years ago of a trans Jew in San Francisco who was part of the FTM, trans man community, and was like, yeah, there's way too many Jews here. I don't know why, but there are. And more recent studies have found that that is still the case. There are a lot of trans people converting. And some people have cited that having to explore their identity one way caused them to explore their identity in another way. There's also sort of shared rhetoric. Jewish people believe that there are a finite number of Jewish souls and that every single Jewish soul was at Mount Sinai receiving the Torah. And therefore, converts are Jewish souls in non-Jewish bodies. That is very much the same as trans rhetoric. And so for whatever reason, I'm not a convert. I'm not going to try and explain that to someone else. That would be ridiculous. But I think there is a big trend. And I mean, certainly looking just at Temple Sinai, queer Jews and particularly trans Jews usually make up at least like a fifth of the congregation on a Shabbat service. So this is a significant thing. And beyond just raw numbers, it matters for a lot of reasons. A lot of oppressive rhetoric is recycled. Gender and gender things are typically used as weapons against marginalized people in different ways. Black men are considered hypermasculine and thought of as like animals. Black women are stereotyped as being masculine. Asian men are feminized, etc. And so the ways that we use gender as a weapon against people is something it gets used against Jews, it gets used against trans people, it gets used against everyone. So understanding the rhetoric is a big thing. As I said, Victorian morality and this idea that the Jews are inherently queer has a direct link to Nazi Germany and the sort of views of Jews. And so obviously I don't need to tell you why we should try not to have that happen again. And finally, I think it just kind of lends itself to, in the US, we have a pretty high rate of xenophobia and Christian hegemonic structures where if you're not Christian, you're kind of like weird and not meant to be here. And that gets put on queer people, that gets put on people of color, that gets put on disabled people. It's all the same. And if you're someone like me who experiences oppression on multiple axes, you realize how much is the same, but just trust me, like it's, bigots are not creative. The other thing that I really want to highlight, especially with where we are currently in the country, as far as opinions towards Jews and opinions towards trans people, this matters very much in a life and death way. Anti-Semitism is on the rise in the US. It's getting worse and worse, and the things that used to work to try and promote liking Jews are seemingly not working anymore for a number of reasons. And this is really alarming. A lot of trans Jews that I've spoken with have expressed this feeling of, I don't know where I would be able to go if the US wasn't safe anymore, because being a trans Jew, there's not really anywhere that's good for both of those things. It's also not great for trans people right now. This is the April anti-trans legislation risk map. So the dark red, it's kind of hard to see. The dark red is they have anti-trans laws. The dark orange is they are at risk in the next 2 years, like extremely high risk. This light orange is there's moderate risk within 2 years of there being anti-trans legislation. So I want you to look at how much of the country has that. That's not good. That should not be the case. And unfortunately it is. And that means that trans people all across the country are in a place where they are not necessarily safe or are very much at risk of being unsafe. And it's also significant in our own community in Reno. Just a couple days ago, we had a trans person commit suicide on campus. And they weren't Jewish. I personally didn't know them, but we have a lot of friends in the community who did know them. And to make matters even worse, the things that were posted about this immediately after both misgendered and dead named this person and purposefully posted pictures before they got this haircut where they looked less trans. And so I just want to take a moment to remember Sky, and my heart really goes out to the people that loved them who are in mourning right now. I can speak from personal experience that when I went to a trans like therapy group back in Las Vegas, I was the only person there who wasn't homeless. It's really rough out there. And so let's like keep that on the burner to remember that like it's really rough out there. But with that being said, let's get into the methods. So my research spanned the course of like 2 years. And I can really split it down the middle of 2 semesters that I actually did data collection. I was able to do this through UNR funding. And in the first semester, I did a snowball sample, which is basically I talked to the people that I knew that were trans and Jewish and 18 and in the US, or like over 18. And then they sent my information to the people that they knew that were also eligible. But in the second semester that I was doing this, I realized that this was kind of a slow process. And so I started posting on social media with IRB approval, and I was able to get a lot of people very quickly that way. So the requirements were just 18 or over 18, living in the US, trans identifying, and identifying as Jewish or adjacent. And I use the word adjacent because Jewish status is kind of debated across the Jewish community. For example, let's say you have a Jewish father, but not a Jewish mother. In some communities, you're Jewish. In some communities, you're not. Or let's say you're a convert. If you converted in a certain movement, another movement might not recognize that conversion. So overall, I wanted to be inclusive of anyone who identified with being trans and with being Jewish, knowing that there are many definitions for both. And so I'm not trying to like establish what that correct definition is. So first I asked them for a pre-interview questionnaire, which covered demographic stuff like age, race, family history, that sort of thing. And then I also, in order to keep people anonymous, usually you just assign them a pseudonym. But as we all know, names and pronouns are very gender important. And so rather than just assigning someone a name, I had them pick out a pseudonym and pseudo pronouns if they wanted. And so that has been really fun. Some of them picked very funny and silly nicknames like Fagela, which means gay in Yiddish, or Babka, which is a dessert. And then I interviewed them. I asked like 20 different questions with extremely like long open-ended answers, asking them about their identities and the stories of their identities, how they came to be, asking them about what positive and negative experiences that they've had in Jewish communities, in queer communities in general, whether they felt included and welcomed, or if they had any kind of like alienating experiences, what the best and the worst things were about being a trans Jew, and asking them about how they signal to other people that they are queer and Jewish, if they do. For example, I wear this and I dress like this. That's a great example. And then finally, kind of what this is all about, what do they need from people who are allies and members of the community and just generally? And also, because I became aware of the fact that doing this research, I was essentially creating a generation of queer elders that for the future will be really useful and helpful for future trans Jews. I asked, what does a trans Jew got to do around here to survive? Not in those words. And then I got into the data coding. My mentor was really helpful for this. She was like, that was actually kind of the reason why I had her be my mentor. This was something that she knew how to do that I really did not. So it basically took 3 steps. A holistic review of the transcripts where I just read back through over the transcripts. And then I scanned for themes, anything that seemed like I was seeing it a lot. And then finally organizing the data by those themes. So the demographics for what I got in terms of who actually got participated was kind of all over the board. As you can see, hopefully you can see, there were a number of people that identified as intersex. This was really interesting to me. I did put a star for people who didn't necessarily identify with the word intersex, but had intersex characteristics. Intersex identity is like a whole nother boat. Very interesting. Also, over 50% of people that participated in this study were either patrilineal or a convert, meaning that over 50% of the people that I talked to would have been in a position where their Jewish identity is questioned in a similar way to how their gender identity is questioned. And that feels very interesting and significant to me. As far as minchag or custom, Yes.
I can't see well enough how many people total responded, participated.
I think it's 44. Yeah. As far as minchag or custom, the vast majority were Ashkenazi. This is pretty par for the course. It's the US that is the majority of American Jews. But what was really interesting to me was when I asked about their movement affiliation, a very large number, the largest number of any of the groups, identified with more than one movement, and some of them really identified with very different movements. So that is something that I will show you in a graph. First, age. So age range wise, I had participants from the ages of 18 to 42, but the vast majority of people were within the 22 to 30 range, so sort of that right out of college, young adult type range. And then back to this, so the Ashkenazis were like 75%. But as I said, the movement thing, this category is the multiple identifying. And when you break down what they mean by multiple, a lot of them did identify with reform, but also identified with many other different movements. And this is actually something that I really noticed with people that I spoke with. They identified as reform maybe because they wanted to be in a synagogue that welcomed them as a trans person, and the Reform synagogue in their community was the only one that did. But in terms of their own personal practice, they were more observant or wanted a more observant space than the Reform synagogue really did. And so that was really interesting to me, partially because I relate to that a lot. And as you can see from this is literally all of their identifications with race and gender. I could not put this into any kind of graph. I guess it just goes to show that race and gender are complicated and not necessarily boxable, particularly for this population. I do want to point out that a number of people identified their race as Jewish and not white, and like distinguished those two things, which is very interesting to me. I'm not going to say what I think about that because I don't think that is relevant. But to kind of give you an idea of the sort of Joe Schmo of the participants, the average person, the average that I had was sort of a white, young adult, non-binary identifying convert or patrilineal person who didn't really identify with one movement or another, but kind of straddled these communities. And I think that's very interesting because in a lot of ways, they're straddling many different identities and kind of not really picking one for like anything, which is really interesting. As far as trends that I noted, first of all, like I said, trans Jews don't align with one particular movement of Judaism. And I think that really goes to show that the trans Jews are going to be many different types of Jews and want to be welcome in any of those types. Jewish practices among these participants diverged significantly from their family. Maybe they were more religious than their family, maybe they converted, maybe they were off the derech, as we say, and like much less religious than their family. Many trans Jews had converted to Judaism, and the sort of tokenization that you experience as a trans person in a Jewish space or a Jewish person in a queer space kind of led to this really strong sense of community with other queer Jews, where as soon as you meet another queer Jew, you're best friends. And this also leads to some very funny jokes. You'll see a couple of them when we go to the social hall for some nosh, but trans Jews are hilarious. As far as problems that they expressed, obviously, just the very baseline, it's two sources of oppression rather than just one. That's basic intersectionality. But in addition, there was a lot of transphobia and queerphobia in Jewish spaces from different kind of, along different lines. So in certain more Orthodox type communities, you had, sort of halachic authorities, Jewish law authorities, who were saying, anti-trans and anti-gay things, and also kind of pushing these anti-gay, anti-cross-dressing, anti-transition type laws. That is a bag of cats, to say the least. But in addition to that, in sort of more of like this kind of space, gendered Hebrew was like a big problem for people. Unfortunately, Hebrew is a very gendered language, and the language we use around Jewish rituals is extremely gendered. Even your name, Jewishly, is something, son or daughter of something. And while like more progressive communities have started bringing in mibate, from the house of, it's not really used in most places, and it is still very alienating for a lot of people. So having more gender neutral Hebrew options and ritual options was like a thing that was necessary. And then finally, we get to this thing that one scholar, Judith Cohen, I think was her name, called the Naches machine. Naches is like pride or joy in Yiddish. And the Naches machine is basically that when you come out, you can kind of barter for acceptance by still having a married partner and children. Like, oh, it's fine that I'm gay because I'll still give you grandkids. And while this is all well and good for people who want to do that, what if you don't? And so that's a lot of pressure on people. There's also anti-Semitism in queer spaces, and it's bad. It breaks down into a lot of different things. The two really big ones were Israel-related stuff and anti-theism. So when I say Israel-related stuff, I'm not trying to say that being anti-Israel or being anti-Zionist is inherently anti-Semitic. That's not true at all. Criticizing a government is criticizing a government. It has nothing to do with a religion. But when you're going up to a Jew and immediately needing to have their opinion on a political topic in order to welcome them or not welcome them into a space, that's not very good. There's also been multiple instances of Jews being kicked out of pride parades because they were carrying a flag that was a rainbow flag with a Star of David in the middle. And they were kicked out because the flag was too similar to the Israeli flag. Very progressive. As far as anti-theism, it is true that a lot of queer people have religious trauma from any number of religious backgrounds. And that is very real and very valid. However, anti-theists tend to be ex-Christians who assume that anti-theist, like theism. Yeah. Kind of believing that all religions are like their particular experience, and then looking down on people who are religious or harassing people who are religious. And this is not just a Jewish problem. I've heard of many hijabi and other religious types in queer spaces being like judged. One of the people I actually interviewed said she was literally fetishized for being someone who presented as sort of a Orthodox looking woman with a long skirt and covered hair, where they were at a queer heavy community event and had someone like try and like make out with them and stuff, as like a weird fetish thing. I don't know. There's a lot going on there. I was honestly shocked and appalled when I heard that, but so that is all that. Also just kind of your garden variety anti-Semitism, the sort of, there's a secret community that controls the government and the media and all this stuff, and just not thought about or questioned at all, even though that's like very basic foundational anti-Semitism. So this is kind of across the board for a lot of marginalized communities in the queer community, where queer people kind of assume that they are immune to bias just because they're queer. And that's not true at all. There's a lot of problems with ableism and racism and sexism in the queer community. Anti-Semitism is just another one of those. There's also a lot of issues with what one scholar called double pressure. And this is actually very interesting, specific to queer Jews. So for queer people, there is kind of this assumption that, oh, you've come out, you need to be out and loud and like an activist and fight for change, and like you are a soldier, you need to fix things so that the next people after you will have an easier time. And while it's true that communal responsibility is important, that's a lot of pressure, and it can lead queer people to feel like it's their fault if things don't get better. And unfortunately, this is also the case in the Jewish community. There's this kind of idea of we need to be this city upon a hill, this light unto nations, and try and make the world better for Jews and be loud and proud about being Jewish. And so you get this really interesting double pressure where as queer Jews, as trans Jews, there's this feeling like the whole world is on your shoulders and you need to carry it. And that's just not good for mental health reasons. There's also a lot of other problems that were kind of more intersectional. Polyamory is still kind of not accepted in the Jewish community, and a lot of queer Jews may identify with being polyamorous. There's still a lot of racism in the Jewish community, in the queer community. A lot of people that I talked to who were people of color expressed feelings like, me being trans isn't the issue. It's that I'm walking in as a Black person into a Jewish space. And that was like, ooh, we've had some time to work on that. Also just kind of disability and mental health things. Generally, accessibility for disability purposes is just kind of bad in both cases. And finally, there's, specifically in the Jewish community, there's kind of a stigma around tattoos, piercings, hair coloring, and for a lot of trans Jews, those things are really instrumental in feeling like this is a body that I'm proud of. And so that's something that needs to be kind of worked on. For future steps for you guys. Really quick, there will be other publications. My mentor and I are working on actually 5 different publications. This is one of them, but I will be expanding more on specifically a number of assigned male at birth trans people, their sort of feelings on circumcision, which is really interesting, and like no one ever talks about that. Also kind of the trends that I noticed with a lot of trans Jews using Jewish like religious garb to signal their Jewishness and also subtly signal the queerness. Very interesting to me. And then finally, just sort of more of those intersectional concerns, anti-convert rhetoric and what that does. But for you guys, Jews out there, there's a lot of things that the Jewish community needs to work on. Firstly, I think there's currently kind of this opinion of, well, if you're a trans Jew, you just need to be reform. And that's not really, or renewal, or yeah, something other progressive. And there are trans Jews who are not going to be like really into that approach to Judaism. Who said just because of your gender, you have to be a certain movement? That's ridiculous. And so there needs to be more options for trans Jews across movements. There also is kind of a need for both more institutional support and individual support. So if you're a rabbi or a clergy person, put it on your website, put it around your building that you are always going to be welcoming of LGBT people and that this is a safe place to go, because they're going to check that website. And if they don't see that on the front page, they're not going to feel sure if they should go. If you're not a clergy person and you're just a Jew, kind of a first step that someone mentioned was just saying hi to the new person. Doesn't even matter if they're trans. If you're first showing up to a space, you should be welcomed and made to feel like you're wanted there. And so that's something that you can do. Gender neutral Hebrew is something that really needs a lot of work. I got a lot of different opinions on the non-binary Hebrew project. Some people who really liked it and wanted it to be more widespread. Others who were criticizing it for being mostly around non-Hebrew speakers doing Jewish religious ritual and not really useful for actual speaking. So there just needs to be more work on that overall. There needs to be more consideration for halachic interpretation and religious practices. Unfortunately, rabbis and poskim are not like immune to bias, and trans and gay topics are extremely political right now, which means that they're not necessarily just looking at what the texts say. They're also speaking from their own biases and fears. And so I talked to a number of people who were trans and who were Baal Tshuva, either Chabad or Haredi, ultra-Orthodox. And that is like something that I don't entirely understand how they can manage to live like that, but they really need more support and they want to live by the guidance of Jewish law. We need to have a Jewish legal opinion on some of these topics because they just don't exist. And finally, there just needs to be overall less discrimination against people who are people of color, disabled, or maybe non-monogamous or just not married. We've known that for a while, just restating it. As far as queer non-Jews, fighting anti-Semitism is a huge thing. That goes for Israel stuff, that goes for anti-theism stuff. Generally decoupling the term religion from their understandings of Christianity. And on another note, either having better interfaith events at queer things, like actually having more than like one random Jew and all Christians, or just not having interfaith things. I'm not sure if that's necessarily even the most helpful in a queer space because religious experiences and religious trauma are coming from completely different places. And so, yeah, anyway, also just logistically, every single Pride thing is on a Friday night or a Saturday. That is Shabbat. Your Orthodox friends are not coming. There's also generally never kosher food at anything. So your kosher keeping people are not coming to that. And finally, as I said, stop fetishizing people who are like religiously observant and modest. That's weird. To the general population, the non-trans, non-Jews. First of all, when I asked, like, what do you want the general population to know? Like 90% of them said just, we exist. It's not impossible for trans people to also be Jews or Jews to also be trans people. Don't assume what trans Jewish experiences are. Ask them and listen. You can't just ask, you have to listen. Pay us living wages. There's a really good quote in the social hall that you'll see, but trans Jews should not have to choose between a job where they are safe and welcome and a job that pays the bills. And finally, in a quote that I think is very poignant, Fagala says, "Stop killing us." Finally, to any trans Jews who are here or who are watching, first things first, find your community, even if it's online. You will feel so much better when you have a group of people that you can be your whole self with and that you don't have to hide anything or hold anything back. Also, find your texts and your history. There's this feeling of like transness and trans Jews are new and are like a trend. And that's not true at all. And I think if you can see that we have always been here and you know your own history and your ancestors, that will help. Don't be afraid to try out different Jewish communities and different practices, even if it's not what you're used to, even if you've never been to that particular community. You're probably not going to find the right space for you first things first. Try it out. Don't be afraid. Keep trying. And finally, you're meant to be here. Apologies to people who are not really big on the God thing, but God didn't make trans Jews for no reason. And I don't know what the reason is actually, but there is a reason. And don't let anyone tell you that you're not supposed to be here. And I just want to close with this quote that I love. God blessed me by making me transsexual for the same reason God made wheat but not bread and fruit but not wine, so that humanity might share in the act of creation. As Jews, we believe we are partners in creation, that we are taking something that's raw and unfinished and making it better and improving it. And that's what trans people are doing every single day. So thanks all of you guys for coming. I'm really so blessed for having this opportunity to do this. If you would like to keep up with my research, I don't really know a timeline, so I guess just follow me on Instagram and I'll post about it. Yeah, I Google me every 6 months or so and see if anything comes up. I don't know. Finally, I just want to say we're going to have some Q&A and nosh in the social hall, but first I'm gonna log in to the live stream and see if there are any people commenting any questions so I can answer those. Okay, let's see. This would be, if you're online, this would be a great time to comment any questions. I'll give it like 5 minutes. Tim says, as a trans man, I look forward to hearing more. Thanks for joining us. Actually, I think I lied. I'm not going to do 5 minutes. I think I'm going to do like 2 minutes. I'm impatient. I'm hungry. But yeah, does anyone have any immediate questions?
So, are you involved with the Trans Project at all?
Yes. So that's the thing that I attended. Oh yeah, sorry. Rabbi Sarah Leah said, "Are you involved with the Trans Halacha project by Svara?" No, but I did go to the Trans Halacha day. That was what I referenced with Svara and Shalmala.
Because they're all the Shuvot are going to be published on Svara.
Oh really? Yeah. So the Shuvot by them, it's already on their website. But if it's on Sefaria, that's amazing. Anybody else? Yes.
Can you elaborate please on your comment about the trans and gay discussions are increasingly political?
Yeah, so she asked if I could say more about how discussions around trans and gay halacha specifically is getting more and more political. So over the history of the Jewish people, people who were interpreting Jewish law talked about these things pretty neutrally. Like it was just like, yeah, if you're thinking about doing that, don't. And it was like, okay, that's not great, but at least there wasn't any kind of real fire there. There are modern Orthodox poskim who kind of lean into Christian homophobic rhetoric of you're burning in hell, which isn't even a Jewish idea. So there's some messed up stuff. And of course, you may have to wait 50 minutes because they'll spend the first 45 or so just saying oh, well, all people are made in the image of God and it's not for me to judge, but yeah, so just generally, people are not neutral and their political opinions and affiliations have bled into discussions of Jewish law when really it should just be a neutral kind of, this is what the text says. Yes.
So a lot of these dealt with, for obvious reasons, with human subject research, 18 and up. But having grown up in a Jewish community and with your role as a Jewish educator for children, do you think there are things we could be doing better for birth ritual through B'nai Mitzvah?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that people that I interviewed talked about in terms of sort of the Hebrew school experience. So first of all, the gendered language around B'nai Mitzvah is awkward because even if you're not out as trans, it may feel kind of to be identified as a bar mitzvah versus a bat mitzvah. There's also just some discussion around, even in like a Reform synagogue where it's totally normal for a woman to wear a kippah, kind of this feeling of, if I put on a kippah or not, am I being looked at and judged? Is there something that's gonna come of this? So there's a little bit of that. Overall, honestly, I think the number one thing is having representation in your Hebrew school experience. So for me as a Hebrew school teacher, I'm not like every day just like, oh, this person's gay, but just like, hey, this person we're going to learn about, he's in the Torah, and he had a really close friend. And some people say maybe a little more than friend, you know? And so just having that representation so that kids can see themselves, I think is a really big thing, to know that what they're feeling is not weird and new. Anybody else have any questions? All right, I'm gonna end this then. All right, so we're gonna do Nosh in the social hall, and I encourage you to look around on the walls. I've taped up a couple really good quotes from people that I interviewed, so please read those. Some of them are hilarious. See you.